for lecture number 3 because we had several announcements of clarifications. Minimal phenomenal experience and non-centered self-awareness is the topic Thomas is going to elaborate on.
So, thank you very much, Albert. This is the 9th of March, and this is the third and last lecture. And I've greatly enjoyed this. I've made many notes. I really liked our discussions, but this morning, more than ever, I'm really interested in your constructive criticism, because what I will present you now is a talk I've never given in my life before. I don't know how long it takes. And none of this has ever been published anywhere, too. So I want to test out a new set of ideas with you today. So you remember that in the first lecture, we looked at the problem of minimal phenomenal selfhood. In the second Carnap-Lecture, we looked at the minimal notion of what it means to have a first-person perspective. And today, I want to look at the problem of pure consciousness. I want to ask, what is the minimal model of phenomenal experience? Is there anything like the essence of consciousness as such? You also remember from the first lecture still the minimal model strategy, the idea of a minimalist idealization as a strategy in scientific explanation, constructing a model that is not characterized by maximal accuracy constraints for causal mechanisms, but that just extracts the core causal factor and the essential character of the target phenomenon. So the question is, can we do something like this for phenomenal experience as such? So I want to offer you today a new approach to consciousness as such. It's called the ARAS theory, and it's about minimal phenomenal experience. And the first step in my reasoning is very simple, that philosophers could make a major contribution to consciousness research in trying to go this strategic route of trying to find a minimal, to formulate a minimal model of consciousness, because that is what it might mean to really solve the problem of consciousness on a conceptual level. So again, this talk has a very simple structure. In the first part, I'm just going to ask what is pure awareness and why is it important. I will develop phenomenological constraints to enrich our concept of pure consciousness from Eastern traditions of philosophy, then add constraints from Western philosophy, briefly discuss the problem of evasive phenomenology, and then I'm going to present two positive models of what pure consciousness could actually be to you and make a set of 8 empirically testable predictions. And in the summary and conclusion part at the end, we can try together if we can connect this to the discussions we've had in the previous days. So, what is the epistemic goal for a theory of minimal phenomenal experience? Why is it interesting and why is it relevant? So, if we assume that minimal phenomenal experience is present in all forms of conscious experience, and if it functionally underlies all types of conscious content, then developing an evidence-based minimal model of MPE would amount to solving the problem of consciousness as such. We could prepare a strategy of theoretical unification within consciousness research, because we could ask if there's an implicit kind of phenomenal character which can sometimes be made explicit and which underlies all other forms of conscious experience. Because if this were so, the minimally sufficient neural correlate of minimal phenomenal experience should be functionally integrated with all other conscious states. So from there we could also go in the brain because we would have a foundation for the conscious model of reality. But it's also interesting in terms of heuristic potential and developing comparative and transcultural philosophy. The interesting point is that the problem of pure consciousness has played a much greater role in non-Western philosophy of mind, for instance in Advaita Vedanta and in Buddhist theories of mind, than it has in our own tradition, where philosophers, say like Husserl, have often denied that there is something like consciousness that does not instantiate intentional properties. So let me ask 4 questions to isolate the epistemic goal. Is there a form of consciousness that does not instantiate minimal phenomenal selfhood or minimal perspectivalness? Are selfhood and perspectivalness necessary conditions for phenomenality? We discussed this in Lecture 1 and in Lecture 2. Question 2 is, does something like pure consciousness really exist? Is there phenomenality without intentional content? Question 3, can we develop a minimal model for phenomenality? Is there something like an implicit kind of consciousness as such that we could turn into an explicit conscious experience if we wanted to? We've also discussed this in part in the last 2 days. And another way of framing the epistemic goal is to ask, what is the one maximal abstract phenomenal property? Is there a single most general form of phenomenal content? I don't know if you've ever asked you this question. There is greenness and blueness and roundness and effective phenomenology. But if you've ever asked yourself the question, what is the most abstract phenomenal property? Candidates are unity. Other candidates are phenomenality as such. So let us begin in terms of introduction. I will begin by offering a series of phenomenological and epistemological constraints, which I think a good theory would have to satisfy. The classical monograph in the area is still Walter Terence Stace, 1960, Mysticism and Philosophy. And he said that there's a certain subset of introspective mystical experiences which are exactly characterized by pure consciousness. He writes, there would be no mental content whatever, but a rather complete emptiness, a vacuum, void. One would suppose a priori that consciousness would then entirely lapse and one would fall asleep or become unconscious. But he says, on the basis of his own research, on the contrary, what emerges is a state of pure consciousness, pure in the sense that it is not the consciousness of any empirical content. So Walter Stace tries to describe in his research this form of pure consciousness as the bare unity of the manifold of consciousness from which the manifold itself has been obliterated. Still, the classical edited collection in this field is this 1993 collection, Oxford University Press by Robert Foreman, The Problem of Pure Consciousness. Robert Foreman very straightly defines PCEs, pure consciousness events, phenomenal episodes not instantiating intentional properties. Very simple and straightforward, intelligible for all philosophers. But he also says something that I have thought must be right for more than 30 years. I've thought that. And he writes, the gene structure of Escherichia coli, for example, has contributed significantly to our understanding of gene functioning in more complex organisms. Mystical experiences may represent the simplest form of human consciousness, and thus by the same token may provide valuable insights into the nature of human consciousness. And this is something I fully agree with, and this is also why I think a minimal model approach could be successful. He talks about pure consciousness events, defines them, wakeful but contentless, and he very simply says pure consciousness is consciousness devoid of intentional content, and he thinks it may serve as the Escherichia coli of consciousness studies, which I think is a very good idea. So PCEs might be a minimal model, and they might be fundamental. Now, the idea with many of these authors is something that is called perennialism in philosophy of religion, which is highly contentious and I think not so easy to argue for, but that this phenomenon is not an artifact of any culture, but but that there is a culturally invariant core of the experience of pure consciousness that all human beings can have at all times in all cultures. But interestingly, Forman even offers, he is a long-term practitioner of meditation, a description, a phenomenological description himself. So he writes, "Sometimes during meditation my thoughts drift away entirely and I gain a state I would describe as simply being awake. I'm not thinking about anything. I'm not particularly aware of any sensations. I'm not aware of being absorbed in anything in particular. And yet I'm quite certain that I haven't been asleep. During it I am simply awake or simply present." This is classical. You can get hundreds or thousands of reports of this type. So phenomenological constraint number one would be there's a phenomenology of wakefulness or restful alertness. People have done research on this, find that a very large and very dominant phenomenological constraints is absence of space, absence of time, and absence of conscious embodiment. In 68% of the subjects you find this. From this we can derive two more very simple and straightforward constraints. First, propositional thought and symbolic cognition are absent. And MPS, as defined in the first Carnap-Lecture, the spatial temporal self-location, is also frequently absent. So we could distinguish a strong MPE thesis which says the following thing: pure awareness is a phenomenological entity sui generis. Conceptually, it cannot be reductively defined or subsumed under a higher order concept. Pure awareness is an irreducible phenomenological kind of its own. It forms a distinct class of conscious experiences, and because it is a phenomenological kind, it possesses a unique type of phenomenal character. We could also opt for a weak MPE thesis and say it is not a phenomenological entity sui generis. Conceptually, it can be reductively defined or subsumed under a higher order concept. It is reducible to a specific type of phenomenal content. Nevertheless, we have a distinct class of conscious experiences, but beyond its minimality, it does not really possess a unique type of phenomenal character. So now, two epistemological constraints. I want to draw your attention to two conceptual problems that I very clearly see with reports about pure consciousness. Here is, in alluding to the Carnap-Lecture number 1, a first classical example of a report for you. I participated in a silent 9-day Buddhist-style meditation retreat. In the second morning meditation of the 5th day, I had an experience of pure awareness. Who knows who this philosopher is? Okay, it's one person in the room. So there's a term called a performative self-contradiction. A performative self-contradiction arises when the propositional content of a statement contradicts the presuppositions of asserting it. If you weren't there, why do you have an autobiographical memory of the episode? If it was timeless, why do you know how long it lasted? If there was no self-location in space, why do you know where it happened? So, in terms of Carnap-Lecture 1 and 2, instantiating an epistemic agent model and minimal embodiment is a necessary presupposition for any autophenomenological report about pure consciousness. We run into the refrigerator light problem in a more fundamental way here, and this is Karl Otto Apel, who died last year, just like Lynn Rudder-Baker. I still studied in seminars of his, and I remember in seminars of Jürgen Habermas, where Habermas always said, Karl Otto schimpft mich, was one of his fiercest critics. So conceptual problem number 2 is, how do we arrive at a positive characterization of MPE reports. So we have reports of these types. We have them over centuries. We have them in different cultures. They're all the same. But what does it really tell us about the positive phenomenal character? What we do have, and I've looked into this literature a lot, there are classical negative characterizations of pure consciousness, and they always involve the following element. It's not a sensory experience, there are no perceptual qualities, it's not a motor experience, there's no movement, there's absolute stillness. It's definitely non-cognitive, it is non-symbolic and non-conceptual, it is non-egoic. That means there's no self-location in time, no self-location in space, no localized unit of identification in terms of the last two lectures. The states are also described as aperspectival, that is, there is no MPP, there's no epistemic agent model, no sense of bodily agency, no conscious self as subject. The whole thing seems not to be a first-person phenomenal character. So, how do we make sense of this in terms of the strong MPE thesis? And problem number one, how can we ever develop any positive characterization? So here is Rudolf-Carnap for you. In paragraph 65, das Gegebene ist subjektlos, auf die logische Aufbau der Welt, he writes, die Ich-Bezogenheit ist keine ursprüngliche Eigenschaft der Grundelemente des Gegebenen. Ja, es muss sogar das Vorhandensein irgendeiner Zweiseitigkeit im Grunderlebnis bestritten werden, wie es vielfach angenommen wird, etwa als Korrelation zwischen Objekt und Subjekt oder sonst wie. So I think he's absolutely on target. People typically speak about non-dual awareness there, but we might, in the light of present investigations,
Can you please translate for non-journalists?
Oh, no.
One sentence summary.
Self-related is not an original property of the basic elements of the given. We must already dispute or reject the presence of any kind of duality, two-sided double aspectness in the basic form of conscious experience, as it is still frequently assumed. For instance, as a correlation between object and subject or in any other way. So he very strongly thought that the given in experience itself is free of any subjective perspective, but his concept of das Eigenpsychische would probably not be tenable in present day in the present day context anymore. I just want to point out that if we are interested in what was so important for him, what are the Grunderlebnisse on which we can buy it? MPE is a much better candidate for the Grunderlebnis in the first place than the examples he used in his writing. So what is the phenomenal character of MPE if it's not subjective? Now here are classical positive characterizations you find throughout the literature, and the first two are very straightforward. Wakefulness, it is simply the phenomenology of tonic alertness. Second, bare awareness, that is epistemicity without content. A phenomenology of knowingness or confidence without an intentional object. The third one is the most difficult one for me, and I'll come back to it at the end of the talk. So especially the best phenomenologists and the authorities on these are really Tibetan Buddhists, and they very frequently speak of brilliance, radiance, self-luminosity. In German translations, often translated as Eigenstrahlkraft. So that is something I have difficulties making sense of, how to satisfy this constraint, but we can come back to it at a later stage. Now I've brought the second classical example to you. It couldn't be more classical. From the Bardo Tudor, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, 8th century after Christ. Now read this with me. This brilliant emptiness is the radiant essence of your own awareness. It is beyond substance, beyond characteristics, beyond color. So it's not a visual experience. The instant of your own presence is empty, Yet it is not a nihilistic emptiness, but unimpeded radiance, brilliant and vibrant. Your own awareness, a vast luminous expanse, clarity inseparable from emptiness, is also the Buddha of unchanging light, beyond birth and death. Just to perceive this is enough. If you recognize this brilliant essence of your own awareness as Buddha nature, then gazing into it is to abide in the state of enlightenment. So now I will put on my hat of the analytical phenomenologist and try to take that seriously. Can we get a positive characterization from it? So you see, I've noted, I've color-coded the predicates. For instance, in green, you have brilliance and radiance. That very obviously refers to the sensory phenomenology of brightness, which is a necessary element of visual experience. That can't be it. Your own seems to refer to a phenomenology of ownership, some sense of minimal phenomenal selfhood. If you look at the blue, vibrant either refers to tactile phenomenology or it's purely metaphorical. Perceiving standardly is defined as sensory object representation under a first-person perspective. That cannot be it. Gazing into is goal-directed active visual perception involving an epistemic agent model, according to the second Carnap-Lecture. This cannot be pure consciousness. So how do we make sense of this? I think it would be intellectually dishonest to now just fully reject reports of this in a way of being analytically rigorous that is actually a way of pretending to be stupid or playing dumb. And you may all know this. There's a certain kind of analytical philosophy that exactly consists in pretending to be stupid. We all know that there are rich philosophical traditions in other cultures, 4,000 years, respectively 2,500 years in Buddhist philosophy, who speak exactly about this for centuries. Millions of meditation practitioners from different cultures in different times somehow find their experience in descriptions of this type, and it would have been easy for me to bring you dozens of descriptions of this type. So to just assume there's nothing there, I think would be a way of pretending to be stupid. And that's not the kind of philosophy we want to do. So here is a contemporary of Rudolf-Carnap. He was born 1 year earlier. He said the advantage of cleverness consists in the fact that one can pretend to be stupid. Doing it the other way around is much more difficult. So this is not what we want to do. Now let us see if we can derive some conceptual constraints from Western tradition. You are probably all aware of G.E. Moore and his famous paper, The Refutation of Idealism, and you're all aware that there has been enormous discussion about transparency and diaphanousness. So this is the classical locus for the concept of phenomenal transparency. He uses these concepts here. He says the other element in an experience of blue, which I've called consciousness, is in some way transparent. We look through it and see nothing but the blue, but we may be convinced there is something, but what it is, no philosopher, I think, has yet clearly recognized. And I think there has been a major misinterpretation of what he actually was about. So Moore, for instance, writes that the moment we try to fix our attention upon consciousness and to see what it is, it seems to vanish. It seems as if we had before us a mere emptiness. And that's a striking parallel to a lot of the Buddhist literature, for instance. And he describes consciousness itself as if it were diaphanous. And then he says the decisive sentence, he writes, that is ignored. Yet it can be distinguished if we look attentively enough and if we know that there is something to look for. So what was the Moore mistake? To read Moore as if he was talking about the transparency of qualia. I have written a bit about Moore and transparency, if you know my work, and we have this massive armchair debate where people talk endlessly about transparency of awareness or transparency of qualia. And I think this whole debate is actually misguided, because the much deeper point in the paper is that conscious experience as such has an introspectively detectable phenomenal character sui generis. Moore really presents us a phenomenological argument. That's what he's actually doing in the famous passage. And the relevant point there is not the transparency of awareness, but the fact that consciousness as such can be made phenomenally opaque. So what I have done is I've looked at all the core passages again and isolated all the really important phenomenological claims from you. Here's what G.E. Moore says. There is one most general phenomenal property which is shared by all sensory qualities. Consciousness as such, pure awareness, phenomenality per se. Under standard conditions, that's constraint M2, this global property is transparent, a mere emptiness. It's not explicitly experienced, but it can be. The property is evasive. It seems to vanish under attentional agency. That is, if we try to fix our attention on it. Constraint M4 is this property can become phenomenally opaque under two conditions. We look attentively enough. Maybe that has something to do with optimizing precision expectations in terms of our discussion yesterday. And we know, because somebody told us, that there is a possible object for introspective attention. Also, Moore says he has found no philosopher who can compare pure consciousness and blue in the way that you could compare blue and green in their mind. I don't know if you've ever tried that. He's right. It's difficult. And he says that his main goal in writing this paper and introducing the concept of transparency actually is to try and make the reader see it. So, two more constraints from Moore. Moore, and this is something where I disagree, says consciousness is a second-order epistemic state. So we have a sensation, which is an epistemic state, and awareness is a relational concept, is awareness of that first-order state. And Moore also says that consciousness is meta-awareness. That is the same type of epistemic relation that is repeated one more time. So in a sense, it's a classical meta-representational theory of consciousness as we have it over the century in the history of the concept of conscientia. So here's my first recommendation if you're interested in this. One of the most substantial and precise papers on the issue is by Benji Helly. And he comes to the same conclusions. He argues that the relation of conscious awareness is not transparent, while acknowledging that it can seem to be. So Helly, in this recommendable paper, comes to three conclusions at the end. He says what Moore considers for its transparency status is the relation of awareness of. What Moore means by saying that something is transparent is that we cannot turn introspective attention to it. That's the classical definition of transparency. You cannot attend to non-intentional properties. And the transparency and diaphanous passages in the paper together are best read as denials of transparency. And I think Helly is absolutely right in saying this. So we can learn from Moore in our project. If there is one most general phenomenal property, then this property is also co-instantiated with every instance of MPS and MPP. It must be underlying selfhood and perspectivalness. It could help us with unification, and it should be in principle detectable when we direct our introspective attention to minimal selfhood or to the origin of the first person perspective, as Moore says it. So my first order interpretation of Moore is that there is an aperspectival and non-agentive representation of raw epistemicity, of knowing as such, that underlies MPS and MPP. So now a brief 5 minutes about evasive phenomenology. You know the refrigerator light problem from the first Carnap-Lecture. You want to check if the light really went out. Whenever you open the door, the light goes on. So the question is, could first-person methods help us in investigating pure consciousness? And the answer is very clear, no, they could never do that. Only zero-person methods could get us there. Now I want to introduce you to a second problem, and I call this the refrigerator sound problem. So the refrigerator makes a sound all the time, but maybe you have noticed it that in a calm summer day you suddenly sit in the kitchen by yourself, it's peaceful, you work, and suddenly you realize the humming of the refrigerator. It has always been there. You have been unaware of it. So the very simple prediction is, if there is a maximally invariant underlying form of phenomenal character, it will almost inevitably lead to an unnoticed absence. It will not be salient, it will be filtered out, and when you try to validate it, then you create a first-person perspective. The refrigerator sound is always on, or is it? So, in trying to detect the background hum of phenomenality, we run into this epistemological problem. So we have the refrigerator light problem, but this consists here in the question that pure consciousness presents an even more fundamental form of first-person indeterminacy as discussed in the first lecture. This is the Carnap point, and we have the refrigerator sound problem, that any highly invariant source of input that is well predicted and well controlled will disappear from the global workspace. So if there's something like pure consciousness, it will normally be characterized by an unnoticed absence. So we go through all these options, like in the first Carnap lecture. We have all the same problems, and we should assume that pure consciousness is first-person indeterminable in general. That is, if anybody went to go there and says, I want to introspectively determine the purity of pure consciousness, if there's really no intentional content, there's no way you could do this. And again, just like for MPS in Carnap Lecture 1, the purity of MPE is indeterminably, so and the interesting discovery is that human beings seem to be introspectively blind to a very fundamental fact about their own conscious experience. Namely, that the origin and foundation of phenomenal experience as such is indeterminate. We don't notice it. You could get romantic and talk about the groundlessness of being or something like that, but we are unaware of it. So all reports will necessarily be contaminated by the belief systems people have. So now I will present you the first model of what pure consciousness could actually be. And the third main step in the reasoning I'm presenting you today is that there's actually good reason to believe that pure consciousness does appear in isolation. So a very noteworthy recent development was, we asked ourselves in long discussion in Mainz, Jenny Wind and myself, what could one subtract from MPS to get a more simpler state? If we could just have temporal self-location without spatial self-location. And there is a reasonably well-documented phenomenon that is called wake sleep, or witnessing sleep, or in modern parlance, lucid dreamless sleep experience. The Sanskrit term is Jagrat Sushupti. It has been reported over centuries in other systems of philosophy of mind. It has played a role in classical Indian philosophy of mind, and we have reports about this state class over many centuries. Recent empirical evidence and theoretical motivation have led to discussions of a new taxonomy promising to ground minimal selfhood and perspectivalness in minimal phenomenal experience. So, if that was true, then neither explicit embodiment nor minimal spatial self-location nor epistemic agency are necessary conditions to have consciousness. And I want to briefly draw your attention to Jennifer Wynn's model of temporal self-location. So I think in their contributions to the Open Mind collection, Evan Thompson and Jenny Wynn have done a major contribution by defining what wake sleep actually is. Lucid, dreamless sleep. It's contentless, there's no imagery, no propositional thought, no bodily self-consciousness, in particular no immersion into a dream scene. There is a phenomenology of knowing, a non-personal, non-reactive witnessing, a phenomenology of observation without an observer, and contentiously there is an experience of a present moment, of mere presence. That would be the phenomenological constraints for waking sleep, for wakefulness during deep sleep. And we have some neuroscientific evidence about states like this. So I'll show you some papers. This is my recommendation. I think the paper from the Tononi group with Richard Davison is probably the best neuroscientific paper. So in experienced mindful meditators, Buddhist monks, you get changes, for instance, in gamma activity during deep sleep. Studies have shown the same thing for senior Vipassana meditation practitioners. I'm not going into any neuroscientific details. There have been papers showing this. So we have some neural correlates and some very sketchy evidence for what that could be. Here's my next recommendation, a 2016 paper in Tics, Does Consciousness Deep Disappear in Dreamless Sleep? By Wind, Tore Nielsen, and Evan Thompson. And the good idea is that if we don't a priori define deep dreamless sleep as unconscious, there are good empirical and theoretical reasons for saying that there are at least 3 different kinds of conscious experience in dreamless deep sleep. And here you have them, and interestingly, one category are exactly these states, selfless states and contentless sleep experience. Sleep experience, they write, will also count as dreamless if they lack not only the immersive and simulational character of dreaming, but also any specific imagery and conscious propositional thought. Witnessing sleep, in which any specific thought, contents, or imagery, including ones pertaining to the phenomenal self, are absent from the sleep state. And my proposal is that that is actually our minimal model of consciousness. That is the purest form of phenomenality we have. Contentless wakefulness during deep dream sleep states. So the concept of minimal phenomenal experience is introduced by Jenny Wind in her commentary on Evan Thompson, and she writes the following things. She says that dreamless sleep experience involves pure subjective temporality, only the phenomenal now plus the sense of duration, and she writes that dreamless sleep experience is a candidate for minimal phenomenal experience. I think Model 1, as here formulated, has at least 3 major weaknesses. The way contentlessness is described doesn't do justice to the explicit concreteness of the emptiness reported by subjects, which is not explained by abstract ideas of an empty temporal frame of reference or pure temporality. These are just abstract concepts. But the phenomenology is concrete. Then this model 1 doesn't do any judgment to the phenomenology of epistemicity. Witnessing ignores the phenomenal signature of knowing. And I also don't believe that temporal self-location plus duration describes the temporal phenomenology of these states of pure consciousness well, because subjects actually report about timelessness in these states. So there seems to be an atemporality constraint that a good theory would have to satisfy. Now I will present you my own model of pure consciousness. It's called the ARAS model of MPE. My general thesis is that what we call minimal phenomenal experience is the representational content of an ARAS model. I'll say what the ARAS is in a second. MPE is actually not pure. It has an intentional object. What pure consciousness dynamically represents is a specific subset of the activity of the ascending reticular activation system. I want to sketch a model under the predictive processing approach, and I will say that MPE is a predictive model of the level of arousal. All autophenomenological reports about pure consciousness are really something else. They are not pure consciousness. There are reports about complex states, MPE plus MPP plus MPS, right? So, what's the background reasoning philosophically? Moore is right. Phenomenologically, awareness of is an epistemic relationship. There's a distinct phenomenal character of knowingness, and we have to do justice to it. There is an experience of subjective confidence. Moore is wrong. Consciousness as such is not a second-order epistemic state. It's a global first-order epistemic state representing a global but not non-intentional state. Model 2 says that a second-order epistemic state is only created by introspection. So that's against constraints M7 and constraints M8. Wind is wrong. Model 1 completely misses the phenomenal character of knowingness, of epistemicity. Model 2 says that the epistemicity is subjective confidence, which can in turn be analyzed as introspectively accessed model evidence, integrated likelihood. Wind is also wrong in missing the concreteness of Moorean or Buddhist mere emptiness. Model 2 says that MPE, if introspected, must appear as a mere emptiness because it models a hidden and internal causal force, namely a non-intentional vehicle property. So if you know my previous work, I have always said that conscious states can vary along a spectrum of transparency and opacity. There's not only transparency, but there's also the phenomenology of mind independence, and the same is true, I would say, of pure consciousness. This means that earlier processing stages can sometimes become available for introspective attention, and you recognize the representational nature. So, if that is true, Moore was right when formulating constraint M4. There is actually a most global vehicle property for conscious experience that can become introspectively available. What is that property? That's how it looks. I think it is the reticular activating system. It's a special subset of the activity of the reticular activating system. This is a network in the brainstem that activates the brain. For instance, when you become aroused in the morning when you wake up. It has to do with sleep, muscle tone, and you have a massive source of fibers that send signals upward into the cortex. So the ARAS, the reticular activating system, arouses and activates the cerebral cortex. That's how the organism turns the cortex on. It controls the overall degree of cortical alertness and the level of consciousness. Wakefulness, sleep, coma research are relevant here. So this is the book on neurocorrelates of consciousness that was mentioned yesterday. My first point is whatever the global neurocorrelate of consciousness is, the ARAS is the strongest signal source and the strongest causally enabling factor for awareness. That is something the brain has to predict. That is a signal source that is much stronger than all sensory input. That's another element of the reasoning. So if you look at how empirical researchers talk about consciousness, you'll find that many papers start with a sentence like this: consciousness has two dimensions, arousal and awareness. That is how empirical researchers think about it, right? So there is an epistemic and a non-epistemic dimension of phenomenal experience. In brain death and coma, you would have low arousal and low awareness. In normal waking states or locked-in syndrome, you would have high awareness, a lot of complex content, and high arousal. In waking coma, in unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, or the vegetative state as it was called in the past, you will have high arousal but no conscious experience, right? People think that there's a minimally conscious state that varies when people move out of coma, that they pass through. So here the idea is that we have to connect these two dimensions in a conceptual way. Now the interesting next point is that there is a law that says that there's an empirical relationship between arousal and performance. And performance doesn't always get better when the level of arousal rises. There is a level of cortical arousals where you would have a panic attack and an anxiety reaction. So, except for very simple tasks, there is an optimal level of arousal, if you see arousal getting higher, where the performance is optimal. There, if you had higher arousal, you would get strong anxiety, and here you would have a lack of attention, for instance. So this is a well-known fact. Now, the ARAS model theory of minimal phenomenal experience says the following things. The strongest and most general signal source the human brain has to regulate and control is actually the activity of the ARAS. ARAS is non-representational. It's purely causal auto-activation. It's what turns the system on. 3. At any point in time, there exists an optimal level of arousal. So there will have been, that's the first conclusion, an evolutionary pressure to adaptively control ARAS activity in order to achieve the optimal level of arousal in a context-sensitive manner. This is something we had to regulate. My hypothesis is MPE, pure consciousness, is a predictive model of the level of arousal. So here is something you would not expect from me. I call it the true self principle. Biological nervous systems represent the world by predicting own internal states via hierarchical Bayesian modeling, thereby inferring the causes of sensory stimuli causing events on sensory sheets, right? The neural body has no self-directed receptor system. It is blind to itself. Right? It cannot know itself in this way. The ARAS model is the only case in which the brain represents and predictively controls a low-level physical state of the neural body itself, namely arousal, by creating another brain state. The metaphysical assumption I'm not going to argue for today is that pure consciousness is identical with that state in the brain. So let us try to sketch a predictive processing model of pure consciousness, of minimal phenomenal experience. You may know the introduction Vanya and I have written for the PPP collection, and let us look at some of the features of PPP models. So one feature is top-down processing, right? Computation in the brain crucially involves an interplay between top-down and bottom-up processing. So here the thesis is MPE is a top-down model of a domain general bottom-up process. It's the model the brain creates of the source of input. The second feature is statistical estimation. PP involves computing estimates of random variables. Estimates can be regarded as statistical hypotheses, which can serve to explain sensory signals. The ARAS model in the brain explains away an internal non-sensory signal by generating a statistical hypothesis about expected levels of arousal. Precision error minimization. PP involves computing prediction errors. They have to be weighted by precision estimates. So for the special case of internal auto-activation, prediction error will generally be low and model evidence will be high, right? Because it's a very invariant internal signal source. Here is again the main point. PP is action-oriented in the sense that the organism can act to change its sensory input to fit with its prediction and thereby minimize prediction error. Another major benefit is that it enables the organism to regulate vital parameters like blood oxygenation, blood sugar, immune profile. Now here my point is the brain's level of arousal is exactly such a vital parameter that the system has to continuously regulate and control. The sleep-wake cycle is the most important circadian rhythm the human organism goes through. So there's attention and precision. We talked about this yesterday. Attention can be described as the process of optimizing precision estimates. So functionally, if you attend to your ARAS model, like a meditator does, right? You try to direct attention to the pure emptiness in yourself. This improves precision expectations for arousal and stabilizes tonic alertness. On a phenomenological level of description, it creates an introspective, knowing self directed as wakefulness as such, the pure experience of wakefulness as such, without contact. So the authors in this empirical literature themselves admit that their taxonomy is very messy. For instance, you will find this concept of vigilance. And then nobody can say what vigilance is. I want to distinguish arousal, that's a graded physical property of the brain. Tonic alertness, that's a functional property determining sustained attention and vigilance. And the consciously experienced phenomenal property of wakefulness, which also comes in degree. So let us distinguish these three things, arousal, alertness, and wakefulness. So then we can say the following things. Attention is the optimization of precision expectations. That's right, Friston says this. The object of introspective attention always is the content of a predictive model aiming at continuous minimization of prediction error. The more constrained, minimal phenomenal experience is available to introspective attention. We can introspect it. And there is exactly one most general and global signal source which the brain must predict and control, the ARAS. So I would conclude that introspective reports about pure consciousness refer to a running ARAS model, and that introspective MPE reports refer to complex states involving a perspective and a unit of identification. There can never be reports about the thing itself. Now, let me see if we can make this a little intuitive for you. This is a complex brain simulation of what actually happens when the ARAS ignites the space of conscious experience. Right? Maybe you see it again. Now, and then the cortical mantle responds. Right? So you have this massive bottom-up process. That's a computer simulation, artificial brain simulation, and higher levels react to this. So the idea is that activation, that non-sensory signal in the brain, is a massive source of entropy that has to be controlled by the system. It massively, when you wake up in the morning, maximizes the degree of variational free energy, which has to be minimized again. The core of the reasoning is that we minimize this variational free energy by becoming conscious, right? By waking up, by creating a top-down model of the ascending input from the ARAS, because the system needs a model of this completely unexpected, surprising cause of internal input. And ARAS is the placeholder for the physical cause of this internal input. So, not to fantasize, let me make some empirical predictions. This is also the way that I'm slowly coming to the end of the talk. So what does the theory of pure consciousness I have proposed, what does it predict in an empirical and in a phenomenological way? If ARAS input disappears, then all conscious experience should vanish. Now here you see this first prediction is really validated. This is almost a trivial prediction. All of coma science has shown this. Here you see how coma researchers have the content of consciousness, the complexity of content in awareness, and the level of consciousness in wakefulness, and they organize phenomenal state classes in this graph. The idea of the theory I'm proposing is to explain how this two-dimensional space opens. It opens by a representation of arousal, right? That it connects the two dimensions. So that is well described, but one prediction would be that if ARAS input exists without an ARAS model, then we would get unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, formerly vegetative state. So if you had patients that had a high level of arousal, but there would be no top-down predictive model, they would be unconscious, but they would functionally run through the wake-sleep cycle, through the circadian rhythm. And that is exactly what you find with patients in the vegetative state. So you have, in the vegetative state, you have the following criteria: no evidence of awareness of self or environment and an inability to interact with others. But you still have functional alertness, intermittent wakefulness manifested by the presence of sleep-wake cycles. So that's when you have the low-level input source and not the ARAS model. You have a form of self-control that's not model-based. Here is my third empirical prediction. It's also trivial, and I think it's also already shown. People who would systematically cultivate introspective access to ARAS input should functionally promote intrinsic tonic alertness and the phenomenology of wakefulness. And that's exactly what you find in Buddhist monks and in long-term meditators who have for thousands of hours in their life optimized their ARAS model and stabilized their ARAS model by optimizing precision expectations for it, by attending to this emptiness, the radiant emptiness in themselves. So there is research on this. This is also basically settled, I would say. A phenomenological prediction. As ARAS input is not sensory input, its model should not generate any form of sensory phenomenal character. It should not generate any movement or motor character, and it should generate nothing like thought. The interesting point to understand is that the ARAS signal itself, right, that ascends from here into all areas of the cortex, it carries no information about internal or external events. It's just what turns on the system. So exactly as Walter Stace, G.E. Moore, and the Buddhist philosophers say, there should be a concrete phenomenology, but one of mere emptiness. Because there is no other model for this kind of phenomenal character. Here's a false prediction. The phenomenal correlate of ARAS input should appear as contentless. ARAS input is purely functional auto-activation, therefore it is non-representational and it has no intentional object. I've said that more specifically in terms of the two last Carnap lectures. There should be no such thing as minimal phenomenal selfhood. There should be no self-location in time, no self-awareness. There should be no sense of bodily agency and no self as subject in this state. That's what the model predicts phenomenologically. Here's another prediction. As ARAS input is maximally distributed in the system and causally enables all forms of conscious processing, the corresponding phenomenology should be ubiquitous, underlying all other forms of phenomenal character. But there should be a refrigerator sound problem, right? MPE is the one thing that should be maximally implicit and evasive. This should be the one form of phenomenal character that you normally do not notice and that you have to actively make explicit. There's a redundancy filter effect, and if you permit this, ARAS input is exactly transcendental. In terms of transcendental philosophy, it's the condition of possibility for experience, but it's non-selfing. Prediction number 6, you're almost there. There are only 8. The internal statistical model of ARAS input has the property of integrated likelihood, what is called model evidence in Bayesian statistics. If we integrate that property of the model, if we introspect it, it should generate the phenomenal character of subjective confidence. I know something, but what I know is mere emptiness. This will create the phenomenology of aperspectival, all-pervading, and selfless knowingness without an intentional object. And that is exactly, I would propose, the description of witness consciousness that has been described over centuries. So here are some recommendations for you as entry points into this literature. The most important monograph is The Disinterested Witness by Bina Gupta. This paper by Miri Al-Bahari would be a good entry point, as are some papers by Wolfgang Fasching also. So there is some philosophical and theoretical work on the notion of witness consciousness. If an ARAS model, prediction number 7, was active during dreamless sleep, it should create the phenomenology of witnessing sleep. Jagrat Shushupti, right? That would be the prediction. There should be a phenomenology of passive epistemicity without content during deep sleep. This could only happen if the functional property of tonic alertness would be preserved in deep sleep, what it is not for normal people. So here are 2 models for you. The idea is as follows. The ARAS is the hidden cause of the ARAS signals in your own brain. The moment when you wake up, the moment when MPE appears and you still don't yet know who you are, is the moment when the cortex has been activated, bottom up, and then creates an ARAS model that tries to model and predict the hidden cause of these ARAS signals. Right? So you have activation, and as always in predictive coding, there will be a signal that tries to cancel out the signal, the sensory signal. Right? The system will try to stay one step ahead of the input. And I'm proposing that is what consciousness is. Consciousness is virtual auto-activation. So as soon as you wake up, your ARAS signal is controlled in a model-based manner. And that model is the phenomenology of being awake, of pure alertness without content. Now, what would lucid dreamless sleep be according to this model? ARAS is in a different state. Signals have been downregulated or reweighted. The activation to the cortex is very slow, very weak in sleep. Model-based control in a Buddhist monk, however, has been trained for many thousand hours. So it could be possible that some advanced practitioners automatically sustain their ARAS model in the absence of a strong ignition loop. I have a dream of alertness. An ARAS model then would be pure MPE in isolation. In these very specific cases of these long-term meditator, we would have model-based ARAS regulation during dreamless deep sleep, and that leads to the phenomenology of witness consciousness. That's the idea, and that is what is described over centuries in all these traditions. So one way to say what waking consciousness is would be to say it's a controlled online hallucination, right? And one way to say what dreaming is would be to say it's an uncontrolled hallucination. Wakefulness during the day would be something like controlled hallucination of alertness, a constant prediction that you will be awake in 500 milliseconds from now. And during witnessing sleep, you would have an uncontrolled hallucination of being awake, if you want to follow this way of describing it. Now let us return to constraint number 2. I said if ARAS input exists without an ARAS model, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome will result. I don't know, if you looked at this graph of the empirical researchers, did you realize that there was one logical possibility missing? Look at the graphics. What is missing? Right, there's one logical possibility missing. Very low arousal and high awareness. So there was an empirically neglected logical possibility, and I would propose that lucid dreamless sleep is the functional mirror image of unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. You have low arousal and minimal phenomenal awareness. You have the rare situation where a top-down ARAS model is sustained in the absence of bottom-up activation. So in the minimally conscious state now, as it is defined now by neurologists, you have a lot of strong things like evidence of self or environmental awareness, purposeful behavior, appropriate smiling or crying, reaching for objects. These are the defining criteria. Now we can see that MCS, as this defined, is not the minimal model of conscious experience. It's much too complex on the level of functionality. But MPE, minimal phenomenal experience, as exemplified by witnessing sleep, lies between unresponsive wakefulness syndrome and the minimally conscious state as it is currently defined. So here is my last prediction. Do you remember in the first talk, that we found that the unit of identification can be expanded in conscious space. We saw it in these robot studies, and we saw it in the peripersonal research done by Andrea Serino and colleagues. So now we can imagine that an explicit ARAS model was active during wake states, and that the unit of identification was shifted from the epistemic agent model and from the identification with the body. Then you would get the classical phenomenology of non-dual awareness, of identifying with pure consciousness as such. So that would be a description of a maximization of the unit of identification, and in that case, phenomenality as such would function as your unit of identification. Now, let me come to the conclusion and summarize what I've said a bit. Let me give you some preliminary answers. We had two core questions at the beginning of this talk. How does auto-activation lead to auto-illumination, right? And what is consciousness as such, if minimal phenomenal experience is the essence? If we have answered these two questions, I think they're the million-dollar questions. Then we've solved the problem of consciousness, basically. So let's have a look. How does auto-activation lead to auto-illumination? The answer is by triggering a top-down version of itself. Consciousness in its essence is virtual auto-activation. what is appearance as such? The answer is pure consciousness is a predictive model of arousal and tonic alertness. MPE is a model of a domain general epistemic capacity of being awake, of being able to represent, of being able to know. So here is a last recommendation. There's an early paper by Barry Dayton, 2002, The Gaze of Consciousness, in which he says something I also endorse but hope to have spelled out in a much clearer way, that pure consciousness is nothing more or less than a live but unactivated potential for experience. So question 1 was, is there a form of consciousness that does not instantiate a self and a perspective? Now the answer is yes, and it's called MPE. However, all reports about pure consciousness refer to episodes of introspective attention directed at an ARAS model, namely these 3 global constraints. An interesting discovery is that you cannot do this during the lucid dream state and during mind-wandering episodes. You cannot attend to MPE. Question 2, does something like pure consciousness exist? No. Minimal phenomenality has an intentional object, arousal. Pure consciousness is an epistemic process, namely a running ARAS model. Question 3, can we develop a minimal model for phenomenality? Yes. There is an implicit kind of phenomenal character, sui generis, which can at times be made explicit and which underlies all other forms of phenomenal experience. Namely, wakefulness, mere epistemic capacity as such. Subjective confidence that something can be known. That's the essence of consciousness, I would say. Is there one maximally abstract phenomenal property? Yes. There is a most general form of phenomenal content, namely tonic alertness as such. It is instantiated by a model of the hidden cause of the single most general signal course. So one idea behind this is that the most general phenomenal property corresponds to the most general signal source the brain has to deal with, the conscious brain has to accommodate. Now one last point, and then we're there. I think we can describe the ARAS model on many different levels of description. Now, let us go back to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I think the first 2 constraints I can easily offer a maximally charitable reading for the clear light of primordial awareness, das klare Urlicht der Lehre, as it is often translated. So wakefulness and bare awareness is no problem. What I still have difficulties with is that 3rd constraint, brilliance, radiance, self-luminosity or clarity. I'm interested in your opinion and discussion. I can only see 2 possibilities of taking this seriously. One is, we could say, people introspect raw ARAS activity, namely a non-intentional vehicle property. That would be possibility number 1. Possibility number 2 is actually a metaphor about epistemische Eigenstrahlkraft. They don't mean it in a literal sense. It's a visual metaphor for the transcendental epistemic capacity that underlies all representation and makes it possible in the first place. So, is that it? Is there radiance in there? You see radiance? Imagine somebody had developed their introspective capacities very finely. Could they introspect the radiant character of the ARAS signal, that it spreads everywhere? Would that be a possibility? I have no idea. So on the level of functional analysis, we go to a higher level of analysis. An ARAS model is a form of self-control. So for instance, you control the sleep-wake cycle. Therefore, an ARAS model can be analyzed under a control theoretic, a cybernetic, and a PP perspective at the same time. It results from predictive control of functional autoactivation, and that leads to an interesting, philosophically interesting result. The ARAS model is a deep causal layer of the human self model, right? It's a way in which we know something about ourselves, our own state of neural arousal. But it is not part of the phenomenal self model. We experience it as non-selfy. So we have a form of self-knowledge that is conscious, but is not a form of self-consciousness. And that is philosophically very interesting. Epistemologically, an ARAS model opens a representational space. It opens an epistemic space. It represents an epistemic capacity. What is that capacity when you wake up? You can, for the first time, represent the world in an integrated global model. So I will end this talk, as I always did, by presenting you 3 types of open research questions. Where should we go from here if this is of any interest? What should we do? Empirically, if I am right that lucid dreamless sleep is the main exemplification of minimal phenomenal experience in isolation, and MPE functions as the minimal model of conscious experience, then lucid dreamless sleep is the relevant target phenomenon for research and computational modeling. In terms of heuristics, the most urgent question is how can witnessing sleep be turned into an experimentally replicable effect in healthy neurotypical subjects? I asked exactly the same question in 2006 about out-of-body experiences, as maybe some of you remember. I said, how can we turn it into a repeatable effect in the lab? We have not managed. It is now 2018. We have a research industry. We have learned a lot about the foundations of bodily self-consciousness. We have full body illusions in virtual reality, but we don't have OBEs. We haven't recreated them. Maybe we can manage for witnessing sleep. On the level of neuroscience and modeling, we of course have to ask where exactly is the ARAS model implemented in the human brain. And most importantly, we have to enter a process of de-idealization. Remember, this is a minimal model. It's a minimalist idealization. The next step in research is to define more fine-grained causal relations. So exactly what subset of events in the ARAS is statistically predicted by the ARAS model? When I say ARAS, this is actually a placeholder, right, for something we will find out through future neuroscientific research. The question is what is the critical subset of ARAS properties? And on the level of philosophy, finally, conceptually, there seems to be phenomenal self-knowledge without self-consciousness, if my story is correct, right? If that is true, it might be of interest to philosophically investigate the new conceptual tool of a maximized unit of identification. And I want to close this lecture series by coming back to a point we discussed in the very first lecture, in the Carnap-Lecture number 1, where we discussed phenomenal indeterminacy and the question of neither norness for minimal phenomenal selfhood, as you may remember. That's what we discussed. Now the question is, if the introspective indeterminacy of minimal phenomenal selfhood really is an experience of minimal phenomenal experience. If that is the reason why it is indeterminate, because there is this pure alertness underlying the experience. I will not go through my 3 summary slides and just leave them for you there so you can look at them in peace. Thank you very much.